Today, the United States stands as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. Its economy influences global markets, its military reaches every corner of the world, and its culture shapes modern life across continents. But have you ever wondered how this nation was born? How did a collection of small British colonies on the eastern coast of North America challenge the most powerful empire in the world and win? How did ordinary farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and intellectuals ignite a revolution that would forever change human history? This is the story of the American Revolution, a conflict that transformed 13 colonies into an independent nation and inspired freedom movements across the globe. To understand this revolution, we must travel back more than 250 years, to a time when America did not exist. In the early 1700s, the eastern coast of North America was home to 13 British colonies. These colonies stretched from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. Although all were under British control, each colony had developed its own identity. The northern colonies focused on trade, shipbuilding, fishing, and manufacturing. The middle colonies became centers of commerce and agriculture. The southern colonies relied heavily on plantation farming, producing tobacco, rice, and indigo. Life in the colonies was far from perfect. Indigenous nations had lived on these lands for thousands of years before European settlement. As colonial expansion continued, conflicts between Native American peoples and settlers became increasingly common. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans were forced to work on plantations, creating immense wealth for colonial landowners. Despite these challenges, many colonists enjoyed a degree of self-government. Local assemblies handled many day-to-day political matters. Because the Atlantic Ocean separated Britain from its colonies, colonial governments often operated with considerable independence. For decades, this arrangement worked reasonably well. Most colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects. They celebrated British victories, traded with British merchants, and proudly identified with the British Empire. Few imagined that one day they would fight a war against their king. The relationship between Britain and its colonies began to change after a major global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. In North America, this conflict is often called the French and Indian War. Britain and France fought for control of vast territories across the continent. After years of intense fighting, Britain emerged victorious. The victory dramatically expanded British territory. However, it also created a serious problem: war was expensive. By the end of the conflict, Britain had accumulated enormous debt. British leaders believed the American colonies should help pay for the war, especially since much of the fighting had taken place in North America. From London's perspective, this seemed reasonable. From the colonists' perspective, it felt unfair. This disagreement would eventually trigger a revolution. In 1765, the British Parliament introduced the Stamp Act. This law required colonists to purchase official stamps for newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and many printed materials. The tax itself was not enormous. What angered colonists was the principle behind it. They argued that they had no representatives in Parliament, that if they had no voice in making laws, how could Parliament legitimately tax them? The phrase, "no taxation without representation," quickly became a rallying cry. Across the colonies, protests erupted, crowds gathered in cities. Effigies of tax collectors were burned. Some officials resigned after facing public pressure. Colonial leaders organized meetings and boycotts against British goods. Merchants refused to import products from Britain. Consumers stopped buying British merchandise. The economic pressure worked. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Many colonists celebrated, yet beneath the celebration lay a deeper problem. Britain still believed Parliament possessed absolute authority over the colonies. The colonists increasingly disagreed. The conflict had only begun. After repealing the Stamp Act, Britain introduced new taxes through the Townshend Acts. These taxes targeted imported goods such as glass, paper, paint, and tea. Again, colonists protested. Boycotts spread throughout the colonies. Women played an important role by producing homemade goods to replace British imports. Communities organized resistance efforts. Political activists published pamphlets criticizing British policies. Among the most influential voices was Samuel Adams. He argued that British actions threatened colonial liberties. As tensions increased, Britain sent troops to enforce order. The arrival of soldiers in colonial cities created additional friction. Residents often viewed the troops as an occupying force, arguments and occasional fights became common, the situation was becoming increasingly volatile, nobody knew exactly when violence would erupt. But many sensed that a major confrontation was approaching. On March 5, 1770, tensions exploded in the city of Boston. A confrontation began between colonists and British soldiers. Angry civilians gathered around a small group of troops, insults were exchanged, snowballs and debris were thrown. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Suddenly, shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, several colonists lay dead or wounded. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Patriot leaders immediately used the event as propaganda. Newspapers published dramatic illustrations showing British soldiers firing into a defenseless crowd. Whether the soldiers acted deliberately or out of panic became a matter of debate. But one fact was undeniable: the event intensified anti-British sentiment throughout the colonies. Trust between Britain and the colonists continued to erode. Each new crisis pushed both sides further apart. And soon, another confrontation would bring them closer to open rebellion. Although tensions remained high after the Boston Massacre, open war had not yet begun. For a brief period, it seemed possible that Britain and the colonies might resolve their differences peacefully. But in 1773, another controversy reignited colonial anger. The British government passed the Tea Act. The law was designed to help the struggling British East India Company sell large quantities of tea directly to the colonies. Ironically, the Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea, yet many colonists opposed it. The issue was no longer simply about money. It was about authority. Colonists feared that purchasing tax tea would imply acceptance of Parliament's right to tax them. Resistance spread rapidly, merchants refused shipments, public meetings condemned the law. Patriot leaders encouraged boycotts. The stage was set for one of the most famous acts of protest in history. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists gathered in Boston Harbor. Many disguised themselves as Native Americans. Their disguise was symbolic. They wanted to emphasize that they considered themselves Americans rather than obedient British subjects. The protesters boarded 3 British ships carrying tea. Working quickly and efficiently, they broke open hundreds of tea chests. One by one, the tea was thrown into the harbor. By morning, thousands of pounds worth of tea floated in the water. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. To many colonists, it represented a bold defense of liberty. To British leaders, it was an act of criminal destruction. The response from London would be swift and severe. The British government was furious. King George III and Parliament decided that Boston must be punished. In 1774, Britain enacted a series of laws known in Britain as the Coercive Acts. The colonists gave them a different name. The Intolerable Acts. The laws closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts lost significant self-government. British officials received greater protection from colonial courts. Additional troops were sent to maintain order. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, these measures united the colonies. Many colonists viewed the punishment as an attack on everyone's rights. Communities across North America sent supplies and support to Boston. For the first time, the colonies began coordinating resistance on a large scale. A sense of shared identity was emerging. In September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the First Continental Congress. The delegates faced difficult questions: should they remain loyal to Britain, should they seek compromise, or should they prepare for conflict? Many still hoped reconciliation was possible. They sent petitions to the king. They demanded restoration of colonial rights. At the same time, they organized economic boycotts and encouraged local militias to prepare for emergencies. The colonies were not yet seeking independence, but they were preparing to defend themselves if necessary. Events would soon force them to make a choice. By early 1775, British authorities in Massachusetts believed rebellion was imminent. Colonial militias had begun storing weapons and ammunition. British commanders decided to seize these supplies before they could be used. On April 18, 1775, British troops marched toward the town of Concord. Their mission was simple: locate and confiscate colonial military supplies, but Patriot networks quickly learned of the plan. Messengers rode through the countryside warning that British troops were advancing. Among the most famous was Paul Revere. His nighttime ride became legendary in American history. As dawn approached on April 19, British soldiers encountered colonial militia members in the town of Lexington. Nobody knows with certainty who fired first, but a gunshot suddenly echoed across the village green. The American Revolution had begun. This mysterious shot later became known as the shot heard around the world. The British continued to concord. There, colonial forces confronted them at the North Bridge. The British eventually began their return to Boston. Along the route, colonial fighters attacked from behind walls, and buildings. By the time British troops reached Boston, they had suffered heavy casualties. The battles of Lexington and Concord transformed a political dispute into a shooting war. Here was now no easy path back. News of the fighting spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Thousands of militia members traveled toward Boston. Soon, British forces found themselves effectively trapped inside the city. In May 1775, colonial leaders assembled once again in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the Second Continental Congress. The delegates faced a crisis unlike anything they had previously encountered. Armed conflict was already underway. A coordinated response was essential. The Congress decided to create a Continental Army, but who would command it? The delegates selected a respected Virginia planter and military veteran, George Washington. Washington possessed valuable leadership experience. Perhaps more importantly, he came from Virginia. Choosing a Southern leader helped unite colonies from different regions. On June 15, 1775, Washington officially became commander-in-chief. He now faced one of the most difficult military challenges in history. His army lacked training. It lacked equipment. It lacked money. And it was preparing to fight the most powerful empire on earth. Before Washington could fully organize his forces, another major battle erupted. On June 17, 1775, British and colonial troops clashed near Boston during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Colonial soldiers occupied defensive positions overlooking the city. British commanders launched a direct assault. Wave after wave of red-coated soldiers advanced uphill. The fighting was brutal. Colonial forces held their ground for much of the battle. Only after running low on ammunition were they forced to retreat. Technically, Britain won the battle. But the victory came at a terrible cost. British casualties were shockingly high. The battle demonstrated that colonial forces could stand against professional soldiers. For many Americans, it was a powerful source of confidence. For British leaders, it was a warning that crushing the rebellion would not be easy. The conflict was becoming larger, bloodier, and more dangerous with every passing month. In July 1775, George Washington arrived near Boston to take command of the Continental Army. What he found was far from an organized military force. Thousands of volunteers had gathered around the city, but they came from different colonies, spoke with different accents, followed different officers, and possessed varying levels of training. Many soldiers lacked proper uniforms, some had little ammunition, others carried weapons that were old or unreliable. Food and supplies were often scarce, discipline was inconsistent, yet despite these problems, Washington saw potential. The men surrounding Boston were determined. They believed they were fighting for their rights and freedoms. Washington immediately began transforming the collection of militias into a unified army. Training became more rigorous, supply systems were improved. Officers were held to higher standards. It would be a difficult process, but Washington understood that discipline and organization would be essential for victory. The survival of the revolutionary cause depended on it. For months, colonial forces surrounded Boston while British troops remained inside the city. Neither side launched a major attack. Instead, both waited for an opportunity. Then, in early 1776, that opportunity arrived. The Americans managed to transport heavy artillery captured months earlier from British forts near Lake Champlain. The operation had been organized by the young officer Henry Knox. During the winter, Knox moved dozens of massive cannons hundreds of miles across snow-covered terrain. It was an extraordinary achievement that in March 1776, Washington ordered these cannons placed on the high ground overlooking Boston. The British suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Their ships in the harbor were threatened, their positions in the city were exposed. British commanders realized they could no longer remain safely in Boston. On March 17, 1776, British forces evacuated the city. Thousands of soldiers and loyalist civilians sailed away. For the Americans, it was a major victory. Without fighting a large battle, they had forced Britain to abandon one of its most important positions in North America. The Revolution had survived its first year. While armies prepared for war, another battle was taking place. It was a battle of ideas. Many colonists still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Even after Lexington and Concord, complete independence remained a radical concept. Most people did not yet imagine breaking away from the British Empire forever. Then, in January 1776, a pamphlet changed everything. Written by Thomas Paine, it carried a simple title, Common Sense. The pamphlet argued that monarchy was fundamentally flawed. That it questioned why a distant island should rule an entire continent. It declared that independence was not only possible but necessary. Paine wrote in language ordinary people could understand. His argument spread rapidly. Thousands of copies were sold. They were read aloud in taverns, homes, and public gatherings. For many colonists, common sense transformed the debate. The question was no longer whether Britain had treated the colonies unfairly. The question became whether America should become an independent nation. Throughout the spring of 1776, support for independence continued to grow. Colonial assemblies debated their futures, local communities discussed political options. Newspapers published arguments for and against separation from Britain. Events also pushed colonists toward independence. King George III had declared the colonies to be in rebellion. British forces were preparing larger military campaigns. Hopes for reconciliation were fading quickly. By summer, many leaders believed that independence was inevitable. The challenge now was convincing all 13 colonies to act together. Unity would be essential. That a divided resistance would almost certainly fail. In June 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration of independence. The committee included several important figures. Among them were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. The primary responsibility for writing the document fell to Jefferson. Working in Philadelphia, he drafted a powerful statement explaining why the colonies were separating from Britain. Jefferson drew upon Enlightenment ideas about liberty, natural rights, and government. He argued that all people possess certain rights that cannot be taken away. Governments exist to protect those rights. When governments become destructive, the people have the right to change or replace them. These ideas would become some of the most influential political principles in history. After intense debate, the Continental Congress voted in favor of independence. On July 4, 1776, delegates approved the final version of the United States Declaration of Independence. The document announced to the world that the 13 colonies were no longer part of the British Empire. They were now independent states. One passage became especially famous: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." These words would inspire generations of reformers, activists, and freedom movements around the world. Yet the declaration itself did not guarantee success. Independence had been proclaimed, now it had to be defended. The colonies had challenged the world's most powerful empire. Victory was far from certain. British leaders viewed the Declaration of Independence as an act of rebellion. They had no intention of accepting it. Instead, they prepared a massive military response. Thousands of additional soldiers were sent to North America. Warships crossed the Atlantic carrying supplies and reinforcements. British commanders developed a strategy to crush the rebellion quickly. Their first major target was New York City. Its location was strategically important. Its harbor was one of the best in North America. Control of New York could divide the colonies and weaken the revolutionary cause. Washington understood the danger that he moved his army to defend the city. What followed would become one of the most difficult periods of the entire war. In the summer of 1776, a huge British fleet appeared near New York. It was one of the largest military expeditions ever sent across the Atlantic. British forces greatly outnumbered Washington's army. They possessed better training, better equipment, and greater naval power. The fighting began in August. At the Battle of Long Island, British forces outmaneuvered the Americans. Washington faced the possibility of total disaster. If his army were trapped and destroyed, the revolution might collapse. Fortunately, he made a bold decision. Under cover of darkness, American troops secretly evacuated across the East River. The escape saved the Continental Army. Although New York eventually fell to British control, Washington's army survived. And as long as the army remained intact, the revolution remained alive. The war would continue. By late 1776, the revolutionary cause appeared close to failure. British victories had forced Washington to retreat repeatedly. American morale was declining, many soldiers were exhausted. Enlistments were about to expire, supplies remained limited. Some people began questioning whether independence had been a mistake, others feared that British victory was inevitable. The future of the revolution hung by a thread, yet in moments of crisis, history is often shaped by bold decisions. And Washington was preparing one that would become legendary. As 1776 drew to a close, the American Revolution appeared to be on the verge of collapse. British forces controlled New York City. The Continental Army had suffered repeated defeats. Many soldiers were preparing to return home when their enlistments expired. Morale was dangerously low. Some observers believed the rebellion would not survive the winter. Yet George Washington refused to surrender hope. He understood that a dramatic victory was needed. Without one, the army might disintegrate. On the night of December 25, 1776, Washington launched one of the most daring operations in military history. Amid freezing temperatures, snow, sleet, and strong winds, American troops crossed the icy Delaware River. The crossing was difficult and dangerous. Large chunks of ice drifted through the water. Many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Some marched with bleeding feet wrapped in rags. Despite these hardships, the army continued forward. Their target was the town of Trenton, New Jersey. There, a force of German soldiers known as Hessians was stationed. These troops had been hired by Britain to help fight the war. Washington hoped to surprise them. Everything depended on speed and secrecy. Before dawn on December 26, the Americans attacked. The Hessian defenders were caught completely off guard. The battle lasted less than an hour. American forces overwhelmed the surprised garrison. Hundreds of Hessian soldiers were captured. The victory at the Battle of Trenton was small in military terms, but its psychological impact was enormous. For months, Americans had experienced defeat after defeat. Now they finally had a major success. The victory boosted morale across the colonies. New recruits joined the army. Soldiers whose enlistments were ending agreed to remain. The revolution had received a desperately needed lifeline. Washington was not finished. A few days later, he achieved another victory at the Battle of Princeton. Together, Trenton and Princeton transformed the mood of the war. The Continental Army had proven it could fight and win. Britain changed its strategy. The British leadership recognized that crushing the rebellion would require a more comprehensive plan. Their commanders believed New England was the heart of the revolution. If they could isolate it from the other colonies, the rebellion might collapse. A major strategy emerged. British forces would advance from Canada southward along the Hudson River Valley. At the same time, other British armies would move north from New York City. The goal was to cut the colonies in half. If successful, the revolution could be fatally weakened. One of the key leaders in this campaign was John Burgoyne. Confident and ambitious, Burgoyne believed victory was within reach, but events would unfold very differently than he expected. The campaign of Saratoga in 1777, Burgoyne's army marched south from Canada. Initially, the campaign appeared successful. British troops captured important positions and advanced steadily, yet problems soon emerged. The wilderness terrain slowed movement, supply lines became stretched, American forces harassed British troops at every opportunity, trees were cut across roads. Bridges were destroyed, food became increasingly scarce. Meanwhile, colonial militias gathered in growing numbers. By autumn, Burgoyne's army found itself trapped near Saratoga, New York. American forces surrounded the British position. The situation became desperate. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. The battles of Saratoga became one of the most important events of the entire war. For the first time, a major British army had been forced to surrender. The victory shocked Europe. It demonstrated that the Americans were capable of defeating Britain's professional military forces. Most importantly, it opened the door to international support. Since the beginning of the conflict, France had watched events closely. The French government still remembered its defeat by Britain during the 7 Years' War. Many French leaders welcomed any opportunity to weaken their longtime rival. However, France was cautious. It did not want to support a rebellion that seemed likely to fail. Saratoga changed everything. The American victory convinced French officials that the revolution had a real chance of success. In 1778, the Americans secured a formal alliance with France. This was a turning point. France provided money, weapons, supplies, soldiers, and naval support. The revolution was no longer simply a colonial rebellion. It had become an international war. Britain now faced a powerful European enemy in addition to the American rebels. The balance of power began to shift. One man played a crucial role in securing French support. That man was Benjamin Franklin. Already famous for his scientific achievements and political experience, Franklin traveled to France as a representative of the revolutionary cause. He quickly became a popular figure among the French public. His intelligence, humor, and diplomatic skills impressed influential leaders. Franklin worked tirelessly to convince France that supporting America was both morally justified and strategically beneficial. His efforts helped secure the alliance that would eventually make American victory possible. Many historians consider Franklin's diplomatic success one of the greatest achievements of the entire revolution. Without French assistance, the outcome of the war might have been very different. While diplomats worked abroad, Washington's army endured immense hardship at home. During the winter of 1777 to 1778, the Continental Army established a camp at Valley Forge. The conditions were brutal. Food shortages were common. Many soldiers lacked adequate clothing and blankets. Disease spread rapidly through the camp. Thousands became sick. Hundreds died. The winter became one of the greatest tests of endurance in American history. Yet Valley Forge was not only a story of suffering. It was also a story of transformation. A skilled military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at the camp. He introduced modern training methods and improved discipline throughout the army. Soldiers learned standardized drills, officers received better instruction. Organization improved dramatically. When the army emerged from Valley Forge, it was stronger, more professional, and better prepared for future battles. The Continental Army had matured into a capable fighting force. As the war continued, it spread far beyond North America. France was not Britain's only new enemy. Soon, Spain and the Dutch Republic also became involved in conflicts against Britain. British military resources were stretched across multiple continents. Battles occurred in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, Africa, and Asia. The American Revolution had evolved into a global struggle. This development greatly benefited the United States. Britain could no longer focus all of its resources on crushing the rebellion. Every ship, soldier, and supply convoy had to be divided among multiple theaters of war. The longer the conflict continued, the more difficult Britain's position became. Unable to secure a decisive victory in the north, British leaders adopted a new strategy. They shifted their attention to the southern colonies. British commanders believed that many residents in the south remained loyal to the crown. If loyalist support could be mobilized, Britain might regain control of the region. Beginning in 1778, major military operations moved southward. Cities changed hands. Communities became divided. Neighbor fought neighbor. In many areas, the conflict resembled a civil war as much as an international struggle. The fighting became increasingly brutal. Both sides committed acts of violence and retaliation. The outcome remained uncertain, but the final chapter of the revolution was approaching. And it would culminate in one of the most decisive military victories in American history. By 1778, British leaders had shifted their focus to the southern colonies. Their strategy seemed logical. They believed many people in the south remained loyal to the British crown. If these loyalists could be organized and protected, Britain might regain control of large areas and gradually crush the rebellion. Initially, the strategy appeared successful. British forces captured important cities and military positions. In 1780, they seized the city of Charleston, one of the most important ports in the American colonies. The loss was devastating for the Americans. Thousands of Continental soldiers were captured. It was one of the worst defeats suffered by the revolutionary forces during the entire war. British commanders felt increasingly confident. They believed victory was finally within reach, but appearances can be deceiving. While the British controlled major cities, they struggled to control the countryside. Patriot militias remained active, resistance continued, and new American leaders were emerging. Following several setbacks, command of American forces in the South was given to Nathaniel Greene. Greene faced a difficult situation. His army was smaller, his troops were often poorly supplied, his enemy possessed superior resources. Rather than seeking one massive battle, Greene adopted a different approach. He understood that he did not need to destroy the British army, that he simply needed to prevent it from winning. Greene divided his forces that he avoided unnecessary risks. He attacked when opportunities appeared and retreated when circumstances demanded. This strategy frustrated British commanders. Every victory they achieved seemed to cost more men and supplies than they could afford. The British won battles but gradually lost control of the region. Greene's approach demonstrated that military success is not always measured by battlefield victories alone. Sometimes survival itself can be a path to victory. One of the most important engagements of the Southern Campaign occurred in January 1781. American forces under Daniel Morgan confronted British troops at the Battle of Cowpens. Morgan carefully designed his battle plan that he positioned different groups of soldiers to maximize their strengths. Militia forces were instructed to fire several volleys before withdrawing. Behind them stood more experienced Continental troops. The arrangement confused the British. Believing the Americans were retreating, British soldiers advanced aggressively. Instead, they walked into a carefully prepared trap. The result was a decisive American victory. British casualties were heavy. The defeat weakened British operations throughout the South. More importantly, it boosted American confidence at a critical moment. The Revolution was entering its final phase. The British commander Charles Cornwallis remained determined to achieve victory. After months of exhausting campaigns, Cornwallis decided to move his forces into Virginia. He hoped this would allow him to regroup and receive support from the British Navy. At first, the plan seemed reasonable. Virginia was strategically important. British forces could operate along the coast and maintain communication with naval units. Yet this movement would ultimately place Cornwallis in a vulnerable position. As he advanced, American and French commanders began coordinating their efforts. A rare opportunity was emerging that if everything went according to plan, they might be able to trap an entire British army. The fate of the war would soon depend on a single campaign. The alliance between America and France was now proving its value. French troops under Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau joined forces with Washington's army. At sea, the French Navy prepared to challenge British control of coastal waters. Coordination between land and naval forces became essential. For years, Washington had searched for an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow against Britain. Now he believed he had found one. A plan was developed. American and French forces would march toward Virginia. At the same time, the French fleet would block British naval support. If successful, Cornwallis would be trapped. It was a bold gamble. Failure could prolong the war indefinitely. Success could end it. In the autumn of 1781, Cornwallis established defensive positions at Yorktown. Soon, American and French armies surrounded the town. Meanwhile, the French Navy achieved a crucial victory during the Battle of the Chesapeake. This prevented British ships from reaching Cornwallis. The trap was complete. Thousands of British soldiers found themselves isolated. The Allies began the siege of Yorktown. Artillery batteries bombarded British defenses. Day after day, the bombardment intensified. American and French troops steadily moved closer. British positions deteriorated. Supplies dwindled. Hope faded. Cornwallis realized that escape was impossible. On October 19, 1781, the unimaginable happened. Charles Cornwallis surrendered his army. More than 7,000 British soldiers became prisoners. The surrender shocked the world. For years, Britain had appeared nearly invincible. Now one of its major armies had been defeated and captured. Celebrations erupted throughout the American states. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered in towns and cities. Many believed the war was finally over. Technically, fighting would continue for some time. But Yorktown effectively ended Britain's ability to suppress the revolution through military force. The decisive victory had been achieved. The United States had won its independence. Even after Yorktown, diplomacy remained essential. Representatives from America and Britain began negotiating a formal peace agreement. Among the American negotiators were prominent leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. The discussions were complex. Territorial boundaries had to be determined, economic issues required resolution, relationships with European powers also had to be considered. After lengthy negotiations, both sides reached an agreement. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. The war was over. A new nation had been born. The victory came at a tremendous cost. Thousands of soldiers had died, families had been separated, communities had been devastated by years of conflict. Economic hardship affected many regions. The war also left unresolved contradictions. The Declaration of Independence had proclaimed liberty and equality, yet slavery remained widespread. Women still lacked political rights. Native American nations often faced increased pressure as American settlement expanded westward. The Revolution achieved remarkable political change, but many of its promises would remain unfulfilled for generations. Future Americans would continue struggling over the meaning of freedom and equality. With independence secured, Americans faced a new challenge. Winning a revolution was one thing. Building a nation was another. The former colonies needed a government capable of maintaining unity while protecting liberty. Leaders debated fundamental questions. How much power should the central government possess? How could freedom be preserved without creating tyranny? What kind of republic should emerge from the revolution? The answers would shape the future of the United States. The American Revolution had ended, but the story of America was only beginning. Conclusion: what began as protests against taxation evolved into one of the most influential revolutions in human history. A group of 13 colonies challenged the most powerful empire on earth and succeeded. The revolution inspired political movements across the globe. Its ideas influenced future struggles for independence, constitutional government, and individual rights. Figures such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and countless ordinary soldiers helped create a nation that would eventually become one of the world's leading powers. More than 2 centuries later, the American Revolution remains a powerful reminder that ideas can change history, that determined people can challenge seemingly impossible odds, and that the pursuit of liberty can reshape the world. The United States was born through revolution, and its story continues to this day.